Hey everyone, this is a piece by Karl Kautsky titled Prospects of the Russian Revolution. Section 1. Proletariat and Bourgeoisie. The first question when the revolution broke out in Russia was, of course, how it would affect the coming of peace. We have already dealt with this in an earlier article. Parenthesis, The Ice Palace, number 26 of the previous issue, in parenthesis. This is I guess I should say this was originally published in Neue Zeit in 1917. I don't know if I said that already. But just as the present war is far more violent than the Russo-Japanese War, so the present revolution promises to overturn the Russian Empire even more than the one in 1905 did. If it prevails, its effects will extend far beyond Russia. It will be the beginning of a new era for the whole of Europe. For despite all the nationalist incitement, the international interweaving of the political life of the peoples of Europe has already progressed too far for such a tremendous event as the transformation of the Tsarist Empire into a democratic republic to remain without repercussions for other states. If democracy prevails in Russia, the Austrian and Polish problems will immediately take on a new face. The idea of Poland's independence and the preservation of Austria drew its strength among the masses of the people who lived there from the hatred and fear inspired by the despotism of neighboring Russia. This will change if Russia takes the form of the United States of Eastern Europe. The Balkan problem will also become something completely different. Even more profound than this upheaval in the foreign policy of Eastern Europe must be the internal policy of the whole of Europe. Its inevitable consequence will be a tremendous upsurge in the political power of the working class in the entire sphere of capitalism. But of course, this is always assuming that the revolution asserts itself and does not succumb to a counter-revolution. The fate of the revolution of 1905 and also that of the revolution of 1848 gives rise to many anxious doubts. All of us who are not stuck in the moment probably feel the need to become clear about the prospects of the revolution. First of all, since it broke out in the middle of the war, they depend on the way it progresses and ends, and not least on the way in which the individual warring powers approach the revolution and show themselves inclined either to make a pact with it or fight it. A military catastrophe for the Russian community could also become a catastrophe for the revolution. In this respect, its prospects depend on the attitude of the governments of the warring states, but also on that of their social democratic parties, including above all the German Social Democrats. But is the revolution not already doomed to failure by Russia's economic backwardness? In its article on the revolution from March 18th, Vorwärts asked the question, quote, has the Russian people improved their situation through the revolution, end quote. And it gave the answer, quote, the future will tell. For the time being, it has only exchanged the rule of absolutism for that of the bourgeoisie, end quote. As a side note, I think this piece was written before the October Revolution, so I think this is, when he's talking about the Russian Revolution, I think he's talking about the February Revolution, not the October Revolution. One might just as well ask, what did the French people achieve in their great revolution? They only exchanged the rule of absolutism for that of the bourgeoisie. First of all, it is absurd to compare the rule of absolutism with that of the bourgeoisie. Absolutism is a form of government. The bourgeoisie is a class that can rule under the most varied forms of government. If we do not make the absurd comparison between the existence of a form of government and a form of government, we will... that's a weird sentence. If we do not make the absurd comparison between the existence of a form of government and a form of government, we will come to the conclusion that the Russian people have exchanged absolutism for democracy. Does this exchange deserve the label, quote, only? In the same article, Vorwärts itself emphasized, quote, we need democracy, quote, for the time being, end quote. It is also not true that we have the, quote, rule of the bourgeoisie, end quote, in Russia. Rather, the bourgeoisie is rather helpless in the face of the events that are sweeping the bourgeoisie away. But this is, of course, a state of affairs that cannot last long. The consolidation of conditions of the new state is closely connected with the decision of the question, rule of the proletariat or rule of the bourgeoisie. There is no bourgeois revolution that has taken place without the active participation of the proletariat. But in the first bourgeois revolutions from 1642 to 1848, the mass of the proletariat entered the revolutionary struggle without any pronounced class consciousness. It was only in the course of revolutionary development, in the first English and the great French revolutions, only after years, and only to a small extent, that it came to confront the bourgeois with its special interest and its special conceptions of state and society. But since then, the proletariat has developed a sharply pronounced class consciousness. And this pronounced class consciousness has not been restricted to the economically most advanced countries, but has also spread to the economically backward countries, provided those economically backward countries have achieved modern capitalism and a modern proletariat. The urban proletariat of Russia have a strong class consciousness, and their socialist leaders are armed with the knowledge of the 20th century. This means, however, that they enter into a revolution in strong opposition to any bourgeois regime from the outset, and that they do not develop this opposition as it progresses. However, the previous Russian state system was such that it severely hindered not only proletarian development, but also bourgeois development, and led the state to ruin. The abolition of absolutism was also urgently required for the bourgeoisie, but absolutism's violent abolition was not possible without the cooperation of the proletariat, which was extremely feared by the bourgeoisie under the given circumstances. So the bourgeoisie offered only very weak resistance to the absolutist regime. Tsarism had to bring Russia to the brink of abyss before it opposed it more energetically, obeying necessity, not its own impulses. But all the more so, the revolution that finally broke out was predominantly a proletarian revolution at its beginning. Will it be able to retain this character in view of the economic backwardness of the empire? And must not a victory of the bourgeois powers destroy everything that the revolution has achieved? These are the questions that confront us. Of course, it is not a question of prophesizing or saying with certainty whether the revolution will prevail or not. Nothing can be said about that, but one can certainly draw conclusions from the data given to answer the question of whether the failure of the revolution is a necessity from the outset. New section, Section 2, Socialism. Above all, we must be clear about the task facing a revolutionary proletarian regime. There are two things that the proletariat urgently needs: democracy and socialism. Democracy, that is, the greatest possible freedom and political rights for the masses, and the transformation of the institutions of state and local government into mere tools of the masses. And then socialism, that is, the transformation of private production for the market into social production, that is, into state, local, or cooperative production for the needs of society. The proletariat needs both in equal measure. Social production without democracy could become one of the most oppressive shackles. Democracy without socialism allows the economic dependence of the proletariat to continue. Of the two great demands of the proletariat, democracy is not unique to it. Other classes can also represent it. But it is, of course, the only class today that, as the lowest of all classes, demands and must demand it with the greatest energy under all circumstances and to the greatest extent. Socialism, on the other hand, is its special demand. All other classes take the standpoint of private production and regard social enterprises at most as isolated aids to private production, not as general means of overcoming private production. The two demands also differ in that one, democracy, can be achieved at once and can be implemented wherever the masses of the people have gained political interest, that is, wherever the masses of people demand democracy, while the other cannot be implemented immediately anywhere, and the extent to which it can be implemented depends on the level of development of capitalism. There is no doubt that Russian capitalism still offers very few starting points that could be developed in a socialist sense. However, considerable steps could already be taken there in this direction by nationalizing large enterprises, the railways, insofar as they are not already state property. The railways of the Russian Empire without Finland have reached a length of more than 74,000 kilometers, of which 54,000 kilometers are state railways. The mines, especially those for coal, gold, and petroleum extraction, and certain giant enterprises in heavy industry. Furthermore, by confiscating the estates of the dethroned dynasty and the monasteries, and acquiring large landed properties by the state, by handing over land to the cities for the construction of cheap and healthy housing, as well as for the production of food for their inhabitants. The main thing, of course, will have to remain the protection of proletarian interest in private industry, extensive protection of workers, especially an 8-hour day, adequate insurance for workers, of which unemployment insurance is particularly important, and supply of cheap food for the working population. Finally, the covering of the cost incurred by the state for these and other reasons, exclusively through progressive taxation of the propertied classes. One may call this a bourgeois reform program, not a proletarian revolutionary program. It depends on the quantity, whether it is one or the other. Here, too, quantity, if it is increased accordingly, must turn into a new quality. Here, too, quantity, if it is increased accordingly, turns into a new quality. It is in the nature of things that the proletariat, as soon as the proletariat feels solid ground under its feet, will seek to use its revolutionary power in the direction indicated here, and that in doing so will meet with resistance from the capitalists and large landowners. How much it achieves will depend on its relative power. Here, too, in the extent of proletarian power, Russia's economic backwardness will make itself felt. Capitalism is the prerequisite for socialism, not only in that it creates its material conditions, but also in that it creates the people who have an interest in bringing it into being, the proletarians. Now, in terms of numbers, the industrial urban proletariat of Russia is certainly still small. This is clear from the small size of the urban population. In 1913, of the 174 million people in the Russian Empire, almost 150 million live in the countryside and just over 24 million in the cities. It should be noted, however, that precisely because of the backwardness of the state, the lack of communications, and the great intellectual isolation of the rural population, their political weight is not as great as that of the cities. Their numerical ratio can be observed in all states, but it is greater in undeveloped states than in advanced states. Paris does not mean as much to France today as Paris did 100 years ago. The political importance of Constantinople for Turkey is far greater than that of Berlin for Germany. In the cities of Russia, especially the large ones, the proletariat already plays a decisive role. Nevertheless, the numerical superiority of the rural population is too great. It is up to them to decide whether and to what extent the proletariat will maintain the strong position it now holds. New section, Section 3, Democracy. Democracy is for the moment even more important than the economic advancement of the proletariat. It would soon be floating in the air if it did not quickly find the means to significantly improve the situation of the working masses. But this immediate effect is not its most important. Rather, it consists in the fact that democracy alone offers the basis on which a permanent advancement of the proletarian masses is possible. Its significance for the masses is not merely that it enables them to gain positions of power. It is invaluable to the proletariat even where, from the standpoint of realpolitik, it offers them no immediately tangible advantages. In order to be able to free themselves, the proletariat must not only find certain material preconditions and be numerically strong, they must also have become new people, endowed with the skills required for the reorganization of state and society. They can only acquire these abilities through class struggle, which, if it is to be conducted as a struggle of the self-governing proletarian masses, not directed by secret committees, requires democratic rights and freedoms. Whatever the new Russian state may offer the proletarians in terms of material gains and positions of power at the moment, this question is less important than the preservation of democracy. This is by far the most important aspect of the present Russian Revolution. It will be hotly contested. We must expect attempts at counter-revolution. What are its prospects? Section 4. The Lessons of a Revolution. Above all, we must consider that this is the second revolution that Russia is going through now within a few years. But revolutions are hard teachers from which every people that comes into contact with them learns a great deal. Not only the classes that are ruled and exploited, but also the classes that rule. Sorry, I think that's a typo here. But the revolutions are hard teachers from which every people that comes into contact with the revolutions learns a great deal. Not only the classes that are ruled and exploited, but also the classes that rule. It says that are ruled, but I think it's that rule is supposed to be what it says. The extraordinary political wisdom of the ruling classes in England is well known. The ruling class in England's attentive study of the needs and demands of the working people. The ruling classes in England's ability, despite the ruling class in England's tenacious clinging to their privileges and objects of exploitation, to always recognize the right moment when one of them can no longer be maintained, and to sacrifice this privilege and object of exploitation, or at least part of this privilege and object of exploitation, in order to save the whole of domination and exploitation. Thanks to this clever policy, the political development of England in the 19th century was much more stable than that of the continent. This is not due to any innate racial peculiarity or superior intelligence of the English, but largely to the fact that the English underwent 3 revolutions earlier than other nations in the age of capitalism as a result of attempts to suppress and oppress the people by force. The least profound of these was the second, the expulsion of James II in 1688, the, quote, glorious revolution, which seemed, quote, glorious to bourgeois thought precisely because it did not come from the masses of the people, but from a faction of the ruling classes. I'm just going to look up Glorious Revolution real quick from the Wikipedia. The Glorious Revolution, also known as the Revolution of 1688, was the deposition of James II and 7th in November 1688. He was replaced by his daughter Mary II and her Dutch husband William III of Orange, who was also James's nephew and had an interest in the throne in his own right. The two ruled as joint monarchs of England, Scotland, and Ireland until Mary's death in 1694, when William became ruler in his own right. Jacobitism, the political movement that aimed to restore the exiled James or his descendants in the House of Stuart to the throne, persisted into the late 18th century. William's invasion was the last successful invasion of England. Despite his own Catholicism, usually an impediment to Protestant support, James became king in February 1685 with widespread backing from the Protestant majorities in England and Scotland, as well as largely Catholic Ireland. However, James II's policies quickly eroded support, and by June 1688, dissatisfaction turned into active yet largely unarmed resistance. The prospect of a Catholic dynasty following the birth of his son, James Francis Edward, on the 10th of June led to a group of domestic opponents to issue the invitation to William, seeking Dutch support to remove James II. The Dutch States General and William were concerned that James might support Louis XIV of France in the 9 Years' War. Exploiting unrest in England and claiming to be responding to the invitation, William landed in Devon with an expeditionary force on the 5th of November 1688. As William advanced on London, James's army disintegrated and he went into exile in France on the 23rd of December. In April 1689, while Dutch troops occupied London, Parliament made William and Mary joint monarchs of England and Ireland. A separate but similar Scottish settlement was made in June. Domestically, the Revolution confirmed the primacy of Parliament over the Crown in both England and Scotland. In terms of external policy, until his death in 1702, William combined the roles of Dutch stadtholder and British monarch. Both states thus became allies in resisting French expansion, an alliance which persisted for much of the 18th century. Despite differing objectives, under William's leadership, Dutch resources were focused on the land war with France, with the Royal Navy taking the lead at sea. This was a significant factor in the Dutch Republic being overtaken as the leading European maritime power by Britain during the War of Spanish Succession. The change in regime also had an impact on England's overseas possessions in North America and the Caribbean. Back to the text. The two great popular uprisings, that of 1642 to 1660, which led to the execution of King Charles in 1649, and that of the American colonies, which began in 1774 and ended in 1783 with the recognition of their independence, were of a completely different character. The English Republic of the 17th century and the American Republic of the 18th century made a deep impression on the English people as a whole. They have given the self-confidence of its lower state classes just as much as they have taught the upper classes caution and accommodation towards the ruled masses. Russia is now receiving the same lessons for the second time in 12 years. They must have an effect on its upper and lower classes in the same way that the English Revolution had on those of England, and thus erect a strong barrier against a counter-revolution. Section 5. The Army. Of course, this barrier is not necessarily insurmountable. The drilling classes of France had been taught the same lessons repeatedly since 1789, and yet this has not prevented counter-revolutions there. This is due to the importance that the army had acquired there. The early and strong impressions of the English revolutions would not have been enough on their own to instill in the ruling classes of England reservations about any attempt to violently suppress a strong popular movement, had it not been for the lack of a large standing army. Since its revolution, England has only developed its naval power unilaterally, and the other peoples of Europe finally resigned themselves to England's naval dominance because it lacked any significant land power that could have threatened them on land. However, with the fleet, one can only become powerful externally, never internally. The other great powers of Europe, on the other hand, primarily develop their land armies and thus create a means of developing power, not only externally, but also over their own people. This made the governments of the continental powers virtually invincible against the rising democracy, as long as they were assured of their army, which obeyed them without will both internally and externally. On the other hand, the position of a government became untenable in face of a popular uprising as soon as the military became unreliable, or even took the side of the people. From the storming of the Bastille to the days of the Paris Commune, the people won in France when the army wavered, and the counter-revolution won when the government was sure of its troops. The same applies to Russia. The dissolution of Russia's armies after the defeats in Manchuria, together with the flood of mass strikes in 1905, brought victory to the revolution. The counter-revolution began when the government again had reliable troops in its hands. Will it be the same this time? Will the counter-revolutionary clique succeed in winning over the army and using the army to crush the revolution? That is the question of the fate for them. Unfortunately, the situation today is very different from that in 1905. Back then, the revolutionary managed to get the Tsar to give in on the constitutional issue, but not to overthrow the Tsar's regime. Command of the army remained in the Tsar's hands, and the Tsar was able to use the army to concentrate the army's reliable elements in the threatened areas. This time, the revolutionaries have seized executive power, and with executive power, control of the army. A counter-revolution would now mean not the overthrow of the people by the government, but the overthrow of the government by the leaders of the army in a coup d'etat, which Napoleon I did on the 18th of Brumaire, 1799. Let's go. Where am I? According to Wikipedia, the coup of the 18th Brumaire brought Napoleon Bonaparte to power as first consul of the French First Republic. In the view of most historians, the coup of the 18th Brumaire ended the French Revolution and would soon lead to the coronation of Napoleon as Emperor of the French. The bloodless coup d'etat overthrew the Directory, replacing the Directory with the French consulate. This occurred on the 9th of November, 1799, which was 18 Brumaire, year 8, under the short-lived French Republican calendar system. Back to the text. The situation for an empire could become favorable if the war continued and was waged enthusiastically by the army. This presupposes that Russia's enemies threaten to destroy its newly won freedom. This would weld the army together into a strong, unified will, but even that would not necessarily make it a Napoleon's tool. Above all, where is Napoleon to come from? The age of the fabulous successes of the war of defeat is over, as the age of the great advantages that officers and often even the common man once enjoyed from the rich booty that fell to the victor. The soldierly spirit that today's method of warfare produces is quite different from that of Napoleon's armies, and therefore the Russian armies will not so easily give a general the overwhelming power that would enable him to carry out a coup d'etat. Moreover, one must not forget that even the mighty Napoleon never dared to lose sight of the revolutionary character of his army. He could only make it serve his purpose by smashing feudal monarchical Europe to pieces as the bearer of the revolution. The use of the army for the purposes of counter-revolution in Russia today is not as simple a matter as it seems to some. But what if the revolutionary government itself, which is predominantly in bourgeois hands, one day becomes tired of the proletarian pressure and tries to remove it with the help of the army? In June 1848, it was the revolutionary government that called up the army in Paris against the proletariat. This case can certainly happen again, but two things have to be considered. Firstly, the Russian army during this war, with its millions of Rulingen quickly brought in, is much more of a people's army, much less a professional army than the French conscription army with its long service in 1848. And then the latter was not indifferent to the mood of the classes of the population from which it was recruited. This is even more true of the Russian army today. In both cases, however, we find the peasantry is the decisive class for the army. Up to now, the peasantry has been more strongly represented in the armies than in the population. The peasant is considered the best soldier, the core of the army. Where peasants constituted the vast majority of the population, they completely determine the character of the army. New section, Section 6, the farmers. In fact, in the revolutionary periods of France and Russia, the mood of the common man in the army ran parallel to that of the peasantry. Here we came across the third factor that has forced the ruling class in England to adopt a more intelligent tactic against the masses of the people. One that is less calculated to suppress them by force than on the continent. In England, the great counterweight to the industrial proletariat, the peasant has been lacking for centuries. In the continental revolutions, the peasant decided their fate. As long as feudal conditions prevail, the peasant tends to go hand in hand with the urban democracy of the petty bourgeoisie and proletariat. Economic reasons are the decisive factor for him. He wants to get rid of the feudal burdens and take control of feudal landed property. In order to achieve this, he allies himself with the democrats of the cities, from the Great Peasant War to the Great Revolution. On the other hand, modern democracy, which seeks to subordinate the government of the entire state to the people, is initially less important to him. The peasants of individual villages and districts, ignorant of life and writing, economically self-sufficient, without constant contact with the wider world, without understanding or interest in state politics, placed little value in state democracy for a long time. For their church politics, municipal democracy was sufficient. In the fight against the feudal lords and their protectors, in the fight to gain possession of property of the church and the emigrants, the peasants joined the revolutionaries of the cities during the French Revolution. They left the fight for democracy in the state almost entirely to the townspeople. They formed a wall against the counter-revolution, insofar as the counter-revolution threatened to restore feudal conditions. On the other hand, they easily abandoned republican freedom. Napoleon was their man. Napoleon protected the economic achievements of the revolution just as Napoleon trampled on the revolution's democratic achievements. If the peasant proved to be an energetic defender of the economic revolution and a lukewarm friend of the democratic revolution, a third factor also emerged at that time. The peasant already showed the beginnings of direct hostility towards the towns, where the determination of the price of food by politics became decisive for the peasant. In general, this question was not very important for the peasant in the times of the Great Revolution, and even in many decades later. His business was based largely on production for his own consumption. He bought little and therefore did not need to sell much if his taxes had been low. Reducing taxes was more important to him than the price of food. But when circumstances arise in which the price of foodstuffs becomes important to the people, and at the same time politics becomes a means of reducing these prices, then a sharp political conflict arises between the townspeople and the peasants. This became apparent in 1793, when France was beset on all sides by hostile rulers and cut off from foreign supplies. The urban democracy was then forced to adopt a policy of maximum prices, against which the peasants rebelled, which brought a discord into the unity of the revolutionary forces. That was only a passing moment, which disappeared with the superiority of the enemy armies, but commodity production developed rapidly from then on. The peasant produced less and less for his own use, and more for the market. At the same time, industry developed to such an extent that the country's food production was no longer sufficient to cover the needs of the industrial proletariat, and the price of food on the domestic market became strongly dependent on the type of trade policy. In the struggle for it, a great conflict between the peasantry and urban democracy emerged, which now became permanent. It is an anachronism if, under such circumstances, a social democratic party still wants to renew the alliance between the proletariat and the peasants, which has been handed down from earlier revolutionary times, and for this purpose creates an agrarian program. In states in which development has progressed as far as indicated here, the strength of the proletariat is not based on the proletariat's connection with the peasants, but on the proletariat's own superior numbers. In the countryside, the proletariat draws its strength from the fact that there, too, the class division between the wealthy and the poor is taking place, although it is often less pronounced than in the cities. In economically advanced states, the fate of democracy no longer depends on the peasantry. It is quite different in a country like Russia. Here it is decisive. The peasantry is decisive. But no one can yet say how the decision will be made, for the Russian peasant has undergone a great process of transformation in the last century, the effects of which are not yet clear. One second. New section, the Russian peasant today, section 7. Until the revolution of 1905, the situation of the Russian peasant had many points of contact with that of the French peasant of 1789. The Russian peasant had certainly been freed from serfdom, but the Russian peasant entered the state of freedom in such poverty and ignorance that the Russian peasant was incapable of rational, intensive farming. The Russian peasant's farms deteriorated more and more, while the Russian peasant's average share of land was noticeably decreasing as a result of the rapidly growing population. Land more and more had become his most urgent need. He was less concerned with the demands of state democracy as long as illiteracy and lack of communication made state authority seem unattainable and incomprehensible to him, as long as his thinking was dominated by the proverb, "The sky is high and the Tsar is far away." When the proletariats of the cities brought the Tsarist regime to its knees in 1905, this, like the storming of the Bastille in 1789, was a signal for revolutionary uprisings by peasants who now demanded the property of the church and the nobility and recognized that they had to support the proletariat of the cities. But the peasant isolation was still too great for the peasantry of the entire state to rise up unanimously. As in the German Peasant War in 1525, the peasant movement in Russia in 1905 became bogged down in local, incoherent uprisings, some of which were violently suppressed, one after the other, by troops who remained reliable, and some of which were appeased by cunning promises. Thus, the proletarian uprisings in the cities lacked the necessary support. It was defeated. But the danger was terrible for the nobility and absolutism. The nobility and absolutism understood the warning. On the one hand, the nobility and absolutism sought to provide a dangerous outlet for the peasants' hunger for land by encouraging emigration to Siberia, and on the other hand, they sought to make the hunger for land irrelevant by giving the peasants the opportunity to switch to more intensive farming. To this end, methods were used such as the abolition of the remnants of village communism, which greatly promoted the division of the rural population into the wealthy and the poor. Absolutism hoped to create a reactionary guard among the wealthy part of the peasantry, or at least to paralyze the revolutionary tendencies of the rural population through it. The emergence of this wealthy class and the intensification of peasant farming were facilitated by a factor that absolutism could neither bring about nor foresee: the rise in grain prices on the world market, which began just after the First Russian Revolution. How far these changes have penetrated and influenced the thinking and aims of the Russian peasantry cannot be foreseen at present, but it can be safely assumed that they have not satisfied the peasant's hunger for land, they have only increased that of the proletariat. And in the case of the wealthy, this hunger is probably not strong enough to urge him to a revolution, but strong enough to make him welcome the exploitation of a revolution that has already taken place for this purpose. But once the peasants have received land from the hands of the revolution, they are chained to the land and will oppose any counter-revolution that threatens them with the loss of this newly won land. This is also the point where the peasants find their closest allies in the socialists, for the liberals, among whom there are so many landowners, not to mention the currently powerless conservatives, will not be very willing to satisfy the peasants' hunger for land. The peasants are less likely to be involved in state democracy, but we should not be too pessimistic about this either. The spread of popular education and transport, the newspaper and postal service is making progress everywhere and is causing political interest to be awakened among the peasants too. Compulsory military service is leading many of them to the cities, and the use of the right to vote is stimulating their political interest. In no country in Europe are the peasants yet ready to take political initiative, but their interest and understanding of political questions is growing everywhere, and with it their interest in democratic rights and freedoms, not only in the community but also in the state, because they give them the opportunity to throw the weight of their numbers into the scales. All this leads us to expect the peasants will remain loyal to the revolution as long as the revolution brings the peasants economic advantages, and that the peasants will not abandon democratic achievements either, even if they may not defend them as enthusiastically and unanimously as the proletariat. But the army was also won over to the young republic along with the peasants and made into its protection wall. In this respect, it has better prospects of survival than the French republics of 1792 and 1848. But if we can expect that the new revolutionary regime will be protected against a counter-revolution, and the peasants will join it and remain loyal, this does not say anything about how they will behave if a conflict arises between the bourgeois and proletarian elements within this regime. These are two entirely different questions, but the peasants' loyalty to the current revolution need not mean that a defeat of the proletariat means that they will support the proletariat's further revolutionary progress. One must expect that they will become a conservative element as soon as their hunger for land is satisfied and their freedom of movement is secured, enemies of every counter-revolution, but also of every further revolution. The sharp conflict between agriculture and the state, and thus between peasants and proletarians, which has developed in Western Europe over the last few decades, will of course not arise in Russia, since it is one of the countries that exports foodstuffs, not imports foodstuffs. The prices of foodstuffs then depend on the world market, are not determined on the domestic market, are thus essentially independent of domestic politics, and therefore ruled out as a cause of conflict between peasants and proletarians, at least in normal times. Now, during the Second World War, Russia has ceased to be a country that exports foodstuffs. What is the Second World War? This is from 1917. I don't know. Now, during the Second World War, Russia has ceased to be a country that exports foodstuffs. The domestic market is the only decisive factor in determining their prices. Any connection with the world market is eliminated. The struggle over food prices in the most direct and most bitter form, and the most bitter form is a struggle for and against maximum prices, has just become a political question that deeply affects the working masses in town and country and is capable of ultimately causing their division. This can result in a nasty conflict between the proletariat and the peasantry, but only a temporary one. In peace, this contradiction, which is so decisive for Western Europe, loses its material basis for Russia. If one can easily, if not exactly, compare the tendencies and needs of the other classes in Russia with the corresponding phenomena in Western Europe, this approach fails in the case of the Russian peasant. The Russian peasants' material conditions and historical traditions are quite unique and have been undergoing a colossal upheaval for 3 decades. In the equation of the Russian Revolution, the Russian peasant is the X, the unknown quantity for which we are not yet able to assign a specific number, and yet we know that it is the largest number, the decisive number. Thus, the Russian Revolution can and will bring us enormous surprises. But just as in the battle of summer with winter, many an icy northern storm may still roar over our land without there being any fear that the rivers will freeze over again. We can confidently expect, despite all possible vicissitudes, that the Russian people will know how to permanently resist absolutism from now on. Come what may, we are confident that the most indispensable rights and freedoms of democracy, and thus the most secure basis for proletarian mass movements and mass organization and proletarian advancement to the conquest of political power, are at least firmly established in Eastern Europe as they are in the West. I want to go back to that part that says during the Second War. I can't look it up. All right, well, that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.